Well, hey folks, thanks for tuning in to CCC today. If you have a Bible, get to the book of Ezekiel, chapter 34. I'm sure many of you were saying, man, I hope Dave talks about Ezekiel this week. I was just thinking about Ezekiel and would love to hear about Ezekiel. I've been wondering about Ezekiel. Well, if that's you, it's your lucky day because we're talking about Ezekiel 34. Now, there are 31 verses in Ezekiel 34, but I'll start with the first several verses and then we'll skip to some other parts of the chapter. So here we go. Ezekiel 34, beginning in verse 1. The word of the Lord came to me. Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Woe to you, shepherds of Israel, who only take care of yourselves. Should not shepherds take care of the flock? You eat the curds, clothe yourselves with the wool, and slaughter the choice animals, but you do not take care of the flock. You have not strengthened the weak or healed the sick or bound up the injured. You have not brought back the strays or searched for the lost. You have ruled them harshly and brutally. So they were scattered because there was no shepherd. And when they were scattered, they became food for all the wild animals. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I myself will search for my sheep and look after them. As a shepherd looks after his scattered flock when he is with them, so will I look after my sheep. I myself will tend my sheep and have them lie down, declares the sovereign Lord. I will search for the lost and bring back the strays. I will bind up the injured and strengthen the weak, but the sleek and the strong I will destroy. I will shepherd the flock with justice. I will place over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he will tend them. He will tend them and be their shepherd. I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David will be the prince among them. I, the Lord, have spoken. All right, so one of the main extended metaphors in the Bible to help us understand who God is shepherd of the sheep. You know, sheep are mentioned more than any other animal in the Bible. I mean, the Bible mentions donkeys 142 times. Mentions cattle 131 times, mentions horses 59 times, camels 47 times, dogs 44 times, eagles 34 times, even an ox is mentioned a handful of times. Do you want to know how often the Bible mentions cats? 0 times. Never mentions them. Not once. Cats are not in the Bible. Cats never made it into God's book. I'm pretty sure God regrets making cats. Anyway, sheep and shepherds, though, are in the Bible more than 500 times. We human beings are called sheep more than 400 times in the Bible, give or take. And God is called a shepherd about 100 times. It's one of the key ways to understand who God is and who we are. This particular section out of Ezekiel here is the most extended in the entire Bible, depicting God as a shepherd, 31 verses in all. The beginning of it, the first 10 verses, kind of give us the setting. The shepherds of Israel were the leaders of Israel, like civil leaders and religious leaders. In fact, in the Bible, leaders are called shepherds. It's the main metaphor for leadership in the Bible. And the first 10 verses here of Ezekiel 34 is God indicting the leaders of Israel, the shepherds of Israel, for having been bad shepherds. And then beginning in verse 11, God tells us what he's going to do about it. But at the beginning, we see the great problem that's before us. And that is that human beings are sheep. And that's not a complimentary thing to say. It's not very flattering because, well, sheep are stupid animals. They're always getting lost. They can't find food for themselves. They're often getting hurt or sick. They're very vulnerable creatures. And they can't really fend for themselves. I mean, most animals are able to find something to eat when they're in the wild, but sheep can't. And they can't defend themselves against any predators either. They're helpless and they're foolish. They're constantly going to unsafe places. You know, they eat unsafe things. It's even a well-known thing that a sheep can't find its way back to the sheepfold, even when the sheepfold is in sight. You know, a few years ago in a village in eastern Turkey, there was a flock of sheep whose shepherd wasn't with them. And the lead sheep ended up wandering around and eventually went off the side of a cliff. Well, guess what the rest of the sheep did? They all went over the cliff as well. I mean, you'd think one of them would have said, I don't know about this. I mean, everybody keeps going over the cliff, but nobody's coming back. Maybe I should pause and reflect on this before just mindlessly going over the edge. But it doesn't happen that way. Sheep don't think that way. They just think, well, Sally went, Stanley went, Herman went, Susie went. I guess I'll go. It doesn't sound like a bad idea to me. Come on, you knew that was coming, right? Anyway, some kinds of animals are able to run wild, like wild dogs or wild horses or wild donkeys or wild boars. But there's no such thing as a wild sheep. I mean, nobody ever said, don't get too close to that sheep, Earl. It's a wild one. No, sheep are completely helpless and foolish. And that's the main metaphor used to describe the human race in the Bible more than any other. And that would sting quite a bit, except that's the way we are. We don't like to admit this a lot of times, but as a collection, human beings are so very similar to sheep. We can make such a mess of our lives. We can wander around aimlessly, not knowing which way to go, which way to turn. We can follow the wrong leader or just go our own way. We can have a difficult time recognizing truth from falsehood. We end up living overstressed, overanxious, hurried, exhausted, insecure lives at times. We can make choices that hurt ourselves or the people around us that we care about. We flirt with a temptation or we dance with an addiction that we know will harm us. We can even be such a slave to what other people think of us. I mean, we can go down a path so far that some destructive or unhealthy habit or pattern just becomes a part of us. We can just make such a mess of life, which is why we need a shepherd. Okay, that's the problem. We're sheep. Now, the next thing we see here in Ezekiel 34 is an inadequate solution for our sheepiness, which are human leaders. That's the inadequate response. Human shepherds. In Ezekiel 34, the leaders of Israel had failed. For instance, in verse 2, it talks about them only taking care of themselves, which is the heart of what makes a bad leader, creates a crisis of leadership and a crisis of shepherding. They're selfish. And in verse 4, they've not taken care of folks who are hurting or lost or are in need. It's just an incredible outline of bad leadership, these verses here. They've not done the things they're supposed to, not cared for people, not led them well. And they've ruled them harshly and brutally, Ezekiel says. Thinking about all this, let me ask you a question. Are we having a crisis of leadership in our world right now, in our society? Would you say we're having a crisis of leadership? Absolutely. But here's the deal. In every society, in every century down through the years, everybody's always been saying, we got a crisis of leadership because we've always had one. It's nothing new that we are so sheepy, and it's nothing new that we don't have sufficient shepherding for our sheepiness. And we got some good shepherds, no doubt, but we got a tremendous number of bad ones. It's the way it is, and it's the way it's always been. In the last 50 or 60 years or so, there have been so many scandals in different areas of leadership, like in government or business or in religious institutions, so that right now there's an unprecedented mistrust of shepherds. There's a mistrust of leadership. There's a mistrust of any kind of authority, really. We're having a crisis of authority, and a lot of it's brought on by bad shepherds. I mean, we've always got some good ones, but there have always been a bunch of bad ones too. And what this is telling us is that human leadership, human shepherds, will not be the final solution. So what will be the final solution? The ultimate solution, the satisfying solution? Well, God unveils it there in verses 11 and 12. And then he gets to it later on as well. But here's what he says in verse 12. He says, I myself will tend my sheep and have them lie down, declares the sovereign Lord. I will search for the lost and bring back the strays. I will bind up the injured and strengthen the weak, but the sleek and the strong I will destroy. I will shepherd the flock with justice. So God says, I will come. I'm going to shepherd my people, which is an incredible statement. It's a prophecy, actually. But then in verse 23, he says something that appears like it's almost the opposite. He suddenly says, I will place over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he will tend to them. He will tend them and be their shepherd. I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David will be prince among them. All right. So first he says that he's going to come himself, and then he's going to place David over them. But David's dead at this point. So what's he talking about here? Well, he's talking about a descendant of David. God will send himself in the form of someone who is the descendant of David. And of course, if we fast forward to the Gospel of John, where we've been living these last 3 or 4 weeks in this series we've been in John 10, Jesus stands up and he says, I am the good shepherd. And everybody knew that what he was saying. It's actually why the religious leaders wanted to kill him when he says this, I am the good shepherd, because they knew Jesus was claiming to be God. They knew Ezekiel 34. They knew what he was referencing. And this is a continual theme we've seen in this series, that Jesus claims to be God. And Jesus isn't claiming to be a good shepherd. He says, I am the good shepherd. And when Jesus says that, he's saying, I'm God who has come to solve your leadership crisis. I'm the solution. Is Jesus the ultimate solution? Well, absolutely he is. Think about this. Jesus is the ultimate shepherd because he has the servant heart of a shepherd. There's a tremendous picture of why this is true at the end of the Bible. It's in Revelation 7:17. And I just want us to think about this. The very end of the Bible, John is getting this vision of the future, and what he sees in Revelation 7:17 is a throne. And in the middle of the throne is an animal. He sees an animal, and yet he knows who that animal is. And here's what he says. For the Lamb at the center of the throne will be their shepherd, and he will lead them to springs of living water, and he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Okay, so catch that. The Lamb will be their shepherd. The shepherd who became a lamb. And you might be saying, Dave, how can a shepherd become a sacrificial lamb? Well, back to John 10 here, verse 12, Jesus says, hey, when the hired hand hears the wolves coming, he runs. And I'm not the hired hand, he says. See, back when Jesus said the shepherding was incredibly dangerous. We don't think of it this way. And I'm not so sure it's dangerous now. But then you're a shepherd and there are all these wild animals, predators out there. And what do you have as a shepherd? You've got a buffet line of all this meat. All these sheep that are here. It's like the Golden Corral for wild animals. And what's between the predators and the buffet line of meat that can't defend itself? What's between them? You are, just you as a shepherd. Just you between the predators and the sheep. And Jesus says, here's one of the ways you know that I'm the true shepherd. I'm not like the hired hand. It's just a gig to the hired hand. And when he hears the wolves coming, he's out. But not me, man. I went to the mat. I put it on the line. Think about this. When Jesus was on the cross, some of you know about this. When he was on the cross and he was being crucified, he quotes from the very beginning of a particular psalm. It's Psalm 22. And he says, God, my God, why have you forsaken me? Some of you may recognize that. And quoting the first line of a psalm is a way of referencing the entire psalm. And what Psalm 22 is all about, if you dig into it and keep going, it talks about all these animals around him, bulls and lions and dogs, and they're roaring and they open their mouths and they want to devour him and take him, He's laying down his life on the cross. He's laying down his life for the sheep. Even on the cross, he's not far from this metaphor of the good shepherd laying down his life. The predators come and they devour him. He becomes the sacrificial lamb so that the sheep are protected. Like all the punishment, all the tragedy that is the result of sin that should come down on you and me has come down on him. Jesus says, I am the good shepherd because when the wolves came after you, they got me. Can you trust a shepherd like that? Oh, absolutely. Completely. There's no one you should trust like you should be trusting him because no one else has done that. He has the ultimate servant heart of the good shepherd. And he has the skill as the ultimate shepherd leader like no other. Only through the cross is there this perfect blend of truth and grace. Jesus can mix truth and love like nobody else. He has the skill as the shepherd leader like no other. You know, every person, even every culture, kind of comes down on one side or the other of truth or love. You know, it never kind of keeps them together because of temperament or personality or something like that. Can never keep that perfect balance between truth and love. You know, some of us, we're like this. We say truth, truth, truth. And if you can work in a little bit of love, great. But truth, 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 that's what's important. And others of us are like this, love, 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 you know, accept, accept, accept. And if you can work in a little bit of truth, great. But love, love, love. But when you believe and embrace the gospel of Jesus Christ, what does the cross tell you? Is the cross making you face reality? Is it giving you truth? Is it saying you're a sinner, you're weak, you're sheepy, you need help, you need saving? Is it mainly truth? Or is it mainly a message of love that God accepts you and His grace is all over you? Which is it? Well, it's both. I mean, there is no other message that won't lead you astray. Only the gospel brought home to your heart through the Word and His Spirit gives you what you need in this way. You won't think too much of yourself and you won't think too little of yourself. You'll be guided. You'll be shepherded. Jesus and Jesus alone is the shepherd that you can trust. And Jesus alone is the one who came between you and the wolves. And Jesus alone is the one who can guide you. I am the good shepherd, He says. I implore you to make Jesus your shepherd. You know, I think a lot of us believe in Jesus, but He's not our shepherd. There's not this closeness as a shepherd with the sheep. You know, we occasionally look to Jesus, maybe when we're in trouble. We'll pray when we're not so busy. We get around to His word ever so often, but there's not this closeness. He's not our shepherd. There's not this intimacy. But you and I, we need Him much more than we think we do. You know, some of us, we're out looking for a shepherd. We sense we need some influence and guidance and help. We know we need a shepherd and we've been out looking for one, but it's not Jesus. We're looking for something else or somebody else to fix us. You know, we're looking for someone to marry maybe, and then that would fix us. But Jesus says there isn't anyone who can do that for you except for me. It's going to be a disaster if you look to anyone else to be the great shepherd of your soul, but me, Jesus says. Look at me. I am the good shepherd, He says. I am huge. I am great. I am transcendent, and I'm surpassingly gentle and humble, and I would do anything for you. He says, I have done anything for you. So just don't look to anyone else to be the shepherd of your soul but me. You know, many of us are Christians, and we struggle to live the Christian life. And we're trying real hard to be a good Boy Scout or good Girl Scout, which is better than being a bad one, I suppose. But it's really more like the gradual adoption of some religious lifestyle than it is a dynamic relating and the ongoing dialogue associated with the friendship of Jesus, the Good Shepherd. Some of us have no conversations that go on with Him throughout our day. Some of us, frankly, look alone in our Christian life, which I can understand, but that's not the way it's supposed to be. Some of us are so scared about the conditions in the world right now, and to understand that if you know the Good Shepherd and you have His strength that comes from Jesus available to you, an ever-present help available to you, and a friend who has promised to walk with us no matter how uncertain the world gets, no matter how uncertain your world gets. You know, some of us are lonely, and we're trying to fill our loneliness by doing the craziest of things because we don't have a friend of Jesus. Some of us are out trying to climb ladders, being more important to people, and we're already important to the one who matters most. We've just got to get to know Him. We've got to talk with Him. We've got to listen for Him. It is the single most dynamic part of the Christian faith, this ongoing dialogue, this continual relating pattern to God Himself through Jesus, the Good Shepherd. No other faith offers anything like this. Only Christianity, only Jesus, only the Good Shepherd. You know, this is such a personal concept, and God is such a personal God, you know, shepherd and sheep. And Jesus talked about this in the most personal way. We'll end with this. He said, the sheep listen to the shepherd's voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them. You know, I remember traveling one time to Louisville, Kentucky. My older brother was living there, and we went up there to see a college basketball game, to see the Louisville Cardinals. They were really good that year, and Bob Russell was a chaplain for the University of Louisville, their basketball team. And Bob talked one time about sitting on the bench at a University of Louisville basketball game when Denny Crum used to be the head basketball coach. Some of you might remember Denny Crum. He was a pretty mild-mannered guy. And Bob said, as he sat on the bench, he was just amazed. And like 20,000 people packing out that arena there, going nuts, screaming at the top of their lungs. And Denny Crum was standing there with a program that was rolled up in his hand. And he was just talking in a real easy conversational tone to his players on the court. And above the crowd and all the noise and all that chaos that was going on, the players, they could hear every single word that their coach said. Do you know why? Because his players had heard him, their coach, Denny Crum, in practice every day. They knew his voice. Do you know the voice of the Good Shepherd? See, the key is to be so dialed into a relationship with Jesus and his word that we can hear his voice when he talks to us, so that we can know what the Good Shepherd sounds like. Just like the sheep come to know, trust, and follow their shepherd's voice, you can do that with Jesus. You can learn to know his voice. And not just that, God doesn't just want you to know his voice, he wants you to know his love. There's that beautiful picture in John 10, Jesus said about the Good Shepherd, he calls his sheep out by name. And when Jesus says that, it means God knows you individually. It's not just like God so loved the world. It's God so loved David. God so loved Melanie. God so loved Adam. God so loved Jennifer, you know. Your body, your temperament, whether you're a thinker or a feeler, an introvert or an extrovert, you know, coordinated or clumsy, tall or short, spontaneous or calculated, prone to be anxious, depressed, filled with doubts. God is not neutral about you. He is not distant from you. He loves you, which is why this truth about Jesus here in John 10 is just the best. I am the Good Shepherd. May the God of peace, who through the blood of the eternal covenant brought back from the dead our Lord Jesus Christ, that great shepherd of the sheep, may he equip you with everything good for doing his will, and may he work in us what is pleasing to him through Jesus Christ, to whom be glory forever and ever. Amen.